I'd like to welcome you all today to the Future of Skills and the importance of a national skills passport panel. We're really excited to have everyone joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land of which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. And this land has been a place of learning, sharing, and community for thousands of years, and it remains so today. So may we continue to listen, learn, and walk together with respect on this country. I'd like to go around and welcome all of our panelists and give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. And Jason, I would like to start with you, Jason LaGreca.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Yes, so I'm Jason LaGreca. I am currently a product manager with the University of Technology, Sydney, looking after student administration, which is a whole big bunch of data with student information in it. So everything from enrollment all the way through to graduation. Prior to that, with the federal government looking at National Skills Passport. Prior to that, Microsoft and other fun places. That's me in a nutshell.
Thanks, Jason. Patrick Kidd.
Good morning. Patrick Kidd. I'm the CEO of something called the Future Skills Organisation. We're a jobs and skills council. There are 10 of us. Each of us represent different parts of industry. So we are responsible for finance, technology and business as industry sectors. And our fundamental role is to try and do what we can to ensure the education and training system is responsive to the needs of industry. And we have a particular responsibility to look after the vocational educational training system, and with that, the training packages that sit in that space. But their role is to ensure that what's being trained best meets the needs of industry.
Thanks, Patrick. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. My name is David Turvey. I'm the Executive Director of Jobs and Skills Australia. Jobs and Skills Australia is a federal government agency body, and our job is to provide advice on Australia's current, emerging and future skills needs and how well we think the skills system is set up to meet those needs.
Thank you, David. John Chu.
Morning all, I'm John Chu, Chief Insights Officer at Navitas. Navitas is a large global higher education provider. We operate campuses across 12 countries globally. And we also run a bunch of standalone higher education providers, including 2 university colleges in Australia.
Thank you. I'm really excited about this topic today because I think that skills are increasingly becoming the foundation for the future. And I'm so excited to see the dialogue that's emerging globally. And so we really are at this pivotal moment in education where everything from the macroeconomics to technology, I mean, we all know AI is coming, to the workforce shifts that will be accelerated by that are happening faster than most institutions can adapt to. So while this industry increasingly is prioritizing demonstrable skills and real world capabilities, for many, the tertiary systems remain tethered in legacy models of qualifications, based recognition. And so for the rise of the ideation of the white paper for the National Skills Passport in Australia to global investment in micro-credentials, which has happened for nigh on a decade. Micro-credentials are hardly new, to the importance of how AI is going to drive hiring changes. So the gap is widening, and we know that. And so my question to all of you really is to kick us off is, what's one signal or shift that you're seeing that shows that Australia and globally are learning that the system really does need to change?
Who wants to kick us off? I mean,
I'm happy to sounds like you might.
Yeah, I've got lots of opinions about what's happening or what needs to happen in particularly the higher education sector and also K-12 to some extent. There are multiple signals. I think the one that's front and center for most institutions is generative AI, and more specifically agentic AI and the agentic web, and what that actually means for higher education. You know, ultimately moving away from a model where it's about selling content to students formally, and you do that for 4 years, and somehow we award you a qualification based on you sitting in a class for 4 years, to a more we need to assess. We need to be the assessors of skills and to verify those skills in a way that's meaningful to employers at the end of the day. That to me is the big one. So, and just looking at, what is the role of higher education moving forward when they're pretty much a closed door, right? Like it's a paywall. The data and the expertise that we have in-house, the facilities that we have in-house are often hidden away from the internet. But when people are out there autonomously using agents to discover information and try and build expertise, how do we expose that? How do we become the intellectual substrate for the future of the internet? That's my thinking.
Thanks, Jason. Patrick, obviously the FSO sits at sort of that intersection, so be keen for your thoughts.
I think there's a couple of key signals that are out there loud and clear at the moment. I think firstly, you've got industry themselves who are less engaged with training. So you've got reducing participation by industry in the training system. You find that they are increasingly dissatisfied, if you like, with the product of the training system. So that comes out of the formalized sort of qualifications that are there. And I think you've also got, exactly as Jason sort of talked to there, the fast changing job environment, and that's driven by technology. It's been going on for a while, but it's now accelerating as a result of generative AI and how that's being used. You're seeing the disappearance of entry level job roles that traditionally were the pathways into work that many people would use. And so increasingly now, unless we start to be clear about sort of the core capabilities and knowledge that individuals need to have to allow them to be successful across a range of different job roles, there is no job role for them to apply to. So we have to think differently about what the employment pathway looks like, and then therefore what the learning pathway is that matches that person to that particular employment pathway. And so there's a lot of change happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was that statistic recently at the World Economic Forum warning of a global reskilling emergency. So more than 1 billion people needing to upskill by 2030. I don't believe that there are any national systems that are prepared with the speed of which we're going to need to do that. So what are some of the key changes and challenges that the post-secondary sector or through tertiary harmonization, David, I promised I'd say it, will need to undertake to address this reskilling emergency? And it is an emergency.
So I think, first and foremost, I think there's one of about is understanding. So it's like it's being very clear about sort of that speed of change that's happening, having a common view as to that speed of change. And then how do you ensure that you are translating that into a pathway of learning? And so I think, at this stage, I think we have a challenge, particularly in the areas that we look after, which is industry increasingly disconnected from the education training sector. And so therefore what their expectations are not really being understood by the education training sector. And so therefore the knowledge and training is not being imparted to the individuals that make sense to industry. So I think there's something that sits around learning pathways, employment pathways, and how we get a better match there. I think when you look at it from an Australian perspective, the core challenge is, right back to what's the big idea that sits at the very heart of it in terms of what are the changes that we need to take and trying to address the fragmentation that exists in the education training system. A fragmented higher education and tertiary and vet education system, the different state governments that have their own responsibilities in their own areas, the different government departments and how they operate. And so if we're serious about this, if we're serious about trying to deliver skills training at scale, then there needs to be a much more strategic approach to how we articulate where it is we're trying to get to, and then how do we get there, I think is a second point. And then I think a third point is when, again, you look at it from an employer's perspective, is we have to find a better way of measuring what we're doing and articulating what value looks like. If training is important, if training has a value, we should be able to quantify that. We live in a language at the moment post-election whereby productivity is everything. So we ought to be able to draw the linkage between skills and productivity, training and productivity. And I'm not so sure we can do that particularly well at the moment either. So those are perhaps sort of three things that really the system needs to try and address if we're going to try and bring it together. There's some great opportunities towards tertiary harmonized sector, that I think has lots and lots of opportunity to help bring us together, but there's lots to be done to set the foundations in place.
Absolutely. And we don't want to end up in an ecosystem where we're effectively just digitalizing paper credentials. That doesn't actually transform anything meaningfully. So how do we look to transform and with the basic structure of education, which is assess, verify, and then hopefully apply. How do we address those skills to ensure that we're providing something meaningful to employers and also individuals so they know that what they've got out of that experience is actually valuable?
Do you want me to keep going on that one,
Yeah,
or
or anyone really?
But I'll give it a go. I think the hardest thing is to get going, and I think sometimes when we talk about an education training system, it's huge, it's massive, and the difficulty is sort of like is how do you change a whole system and how do you change it at the pace that's necessary? And so I think there's some great work that David and his team have done in the last sort of few years, talking about sort of skills taxonomies, the national skills sort of framework that goes with that, the idea of core skills versus skills that are important or qualifications that are important for a particular type of jobs. And qualifications reform that was done over the last couple of years makes this distinction between sort of qualifications that you need for very specific types of jobs that end up having strong regulatory environment to it versus those things which are actually skills needed across a range of jobs, across a range of occupations. And I think we could get moving quicker if we focused upon the easy stuff first, which I think is the core skills that we know that everybody needs to have. Start to move on that, and then recognize that you still have the need for qualifications in certain sort of sectors and spaces, but let's make that distinction between the two things so at least we can start to move in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know sectorally that we get wrapped ourselves in tethers over the red tape and the all the policies and everything that underpins the requirements for that. So David, if I can, from a policy perspective, how can the government support the sector shift to that skills-based learning?
Yeah, and thanks. I might kind of go back to your first question and pick up on some of the things that Patrick mentioned. I guess from my perspective, kind of look at it from the very macro level. The key signal that I'm seeing is the weak productivity growth that Australia's experienced over the last couple of decades. And even the data that came out last week, productivity fell by 1% over the last year. And that productivity growth is kind of the key thing that drives growth in living standards in the long term, right? So this is really important that we lift Australia's productivity performance. And one way that we can do that is to make the labour market match better people with jobs. Like it's a kind of pretty basic concept, but matching people with jobs, the right person with the right skills and preferences with what employers need in the workplace is kind of critical to getting the productivity performance of the economy better, improving it. And I think there's a couple of things that are really kind of critical to doing that. We've done some work looking at what we expect the future job requirements of the labour market will be and comparing that to what's coming out of the education training system. Australia's done a really good job over the last decade or two of pushing people into higher education. But when we look at the future of the labour market over the next decade, there's a lot of jobs that require vocational education that are going to be critical in construction, net zero, the electrification of the energy system, childcare, aged care. There's a whole bunch of really important jobs that are vet-trained jobs. And so we think the education and training system is, at the moment, it's a bit skewed towards the higher education system. And we need more, we need vet to have a bigger role, a more prominent role in the national tertiary education system. There's a bit of rebalancing that needs to go on there. And then, beyond that, we need the two systems working better together. We expect people to move between jobs, to move between kind of careers even over their working life now. So being able to jump into the vet system, the higher education system, do a degree, then go back and do a diploma or go through the foundation skills program and then up through into post-grad study even. So we really need that tertiary education system kind of working cohesively across all of those segments. And then finally, just pick up on the other thing that Patrick's been talking about, and that's the role of industry. I mean, it's interesting when we talk about tertiary harmonisation, we're not talking about blending vet and higher ed, making it all one system. We're talking about bringing out the strengths of both systems. And one of the things I think is, a really powerful strength of the vet system is that we've got industry engagement structured and embedded in the way qualifications are designed. And that's the whole point of Patrick's organisation, is to make sure industry's got a voice in what's taught. there's no structured approach to that in the higher education system. There is no formal mechanism to make sure industry's at the table in designing qualifications in higher ed. So I'm not saying that, the higher education system needs to copy what we do in vet, but certainly there's lessons there about how to get industry more at the table in what we're teaching in higher ed.
Yeah, absolutely. The gap, the widening gap is starting to show here. But John, I know obviously with Navitas operating from a global perspective and having that global lens, are you able to make any comments around that? Because obviously there's other markets, big global markets that have really starting to embrace skills portability and understanding I guess the chasm between industry and higher education, if I can call it that. And so what can we learn from other jurisdictions that we can, if nothing else, try not to have a similar outcome here?
Yeah, maybe just to pick up on David's point, it's that same emphasis on higher education that we've seen in Australia has been very prevalent throughout many other countries as well. So it's not that sort of um, some people might call elitism of higher education or the aspiration for higher education replacing vocational education. That's a problem that many other countries struggle with, and including many sort of emerging economies. So, when students are looking, parents are aspirational, they want their students to continue with their education. It's quite often, university or bust. Like that's kind of their mentality. I'd rather you have a low-level clerical job than to be working with your hands out in the sun. And in many parts of Asia, that's a very sort of dominant sort of cultural emphasis. So I think we've got, I think in addition to the harmonization challenge, I think there's a reputational challenge for vet. How do we make that much more aspirational? How do we put that on an equal footing, like some, particularly European countries have been able to achieve, where it's not, it's not seen as a less than or a residual. Like, if that's what you want to do, that's an equally good use of your talents, your capabilities to go down a more sort of vocational or trade path in places like Germany and places like that. So I think that's a global sort of phenomena and a global challenge. I just wanted to go back to a couple of comments as well. I think on that international stage, I mean, the currency of the degree is really important as well. So in some ways, we know that the sort of higher education system or the vocational system in some countries is not perfect, and we're not recognizing skills well enough. It's kind of become a devalued credential in some ways, but in other ways it's still the best thing we've got. So how do you sort of manage this transition really carefully to say, look, a bachelor degree isn't pointless, and I think if we end up down that path, that's going to be really problematic. Actually, a bachelor's degree is great, a master's degree is great, the AQF still works, it's still a really powerful signal, but we're enhancing it and we're bringing elements in like a passport to help sort of document better what those degrees and what those symbols of quality actually mean. So I think it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but actually trying to navigate the change and strengthen the system that we've got as well.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Especially going back to Patrick's point around seeing the skills, the common skills that are used to be referred to as almost soft skills that are threaded throughout. I did a Bachelor of Arts and I work in STEM, so it's not all, it's not linear, and I imagine increasingly it won't be linear. And I'm going to use the AI one. I'm going to bring that out there. So, Jason, I have a question for you. We know that the likelihood is that AI could potentially be more disruptive to that white collar education, like outcomes and white collar jobs, even more so than what we were talking about with some of the great qualifications that come out of vet, with the caring economy and the really practical hands-on stuff. So can you make any comments in terms of what you see could potentially happen and how the sector could try and navigate that?
I think there's a couple of areas there. Like, I think for the time being, AI will certainly displace more in the white collar worker, information worker space than it will in traditional vocational education expertise, hands-on stuff. But we're already seeing use cases where robotics and AI come together. And mix that with a bit of blockchain as well, and you have fully autonomous robots doing surgeries in China now. So you see that there is a world where these things do come together, and potentially there is a major shift across the entire economy, regardless if it's information work or otherwise. But because of generative AI, it generates stuff, right? So that typically replaces the skills that, hey, I can write a report, but hey, now I can get an AI to do the same thing in about 5 minutes. So sure, absolutely. For me, I think universities need to reflect on what is it that makes them a unique value proposition in this world? What is it that makes us human versus what makes us a machine? So I think there will be definitely an emphasis on critical thought. Really, when you think about it, that's what a degree is meant to teach you. It's how do you critically evaluate what the world is and what's happening around you and make quality decisions based on information and science. Then I think creativity is definitely going to shine again. There will definitely be an emphasis on, performing arts, creative arts. Me personally, I spend a lot of time investing in my own children in the creative and performing arts because I believe humanity will crave these skills. Some of the bigger thinking. So what you're seeing is AI, generative AI particularly, because there are different flavors of AI, is taking away some of the cognitive load that allows us to heighten our cognition. So I think some of the higher order thinking skills, some of those areas that are really where humans shine, will come back into university degrees in a big way versus the static content that you see in a learning management system that gets recycled for 10 years. That stuff will disappear. Hopefully that stuff will disappear sooner rather than later. So we are generating graduates that are able to go into an employment space that can actually be thinkers and transformative and entrepreneurial to drive the economy forward. At least that's what I want to believe.
I think there's just to jump in on that, I think there's a sort of set of fairly fundamental questions that we need to be asking ourselves. I mean, I think, it's, as you look at the application and the use of generative AI and those technologies in us as a workforce, and what does that mean? Work, learning, and life, it's more than just work, of course. But it's what is the impact for how we learn when we are in primary, pre-primary, into K sort of 1 to 12 at the end of the day. I mean, the natures of the skills that people are going to have to acquire, how they learn, that is going to be different, and we need to spend some time thinking about that. The distinction between what is VET and what is higher education, that needs to be thought about. Mm-hmm. I think there's some really interesting opportunities that sit around the idea of a harmonized tertiary sector. But, at the moment we do have this sort of it's almost like a competitive sort of game that's being played as sort of people are coming into the middle, very much with skills at the center, the sort of the middle part of the concentric circle almost, whereby that's part of the world of VET and it's part of the world of universities. And so I think there's some confusion there in terms of what are the respective roles played by the different components of our education training system. And, right back to one of those points made up front about the importance of finding ways of addressing the fragmentation that sits in the system so we can move forwards together, I think remains one of the fundamental sort of challenges that we need to sort of gaze into, which takes you to sort of this idea of a common language, a sort of a taxonomy, and being able to codify these things so that there is something solid around which you can build your future.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, David, I would pass to you.
It's probably time for me to jump in and explain what Patrick's talking about. But look, before I do that, just on the AI thing, I mean, we're doing some work on generative AI and its impacts on the labour market at the moment, and looking at the role of Gen AI in augmenting jobs as opposed to automating jobs. And I think the analysis, at least as far as we've seen in the uptake of generative AI in the Australian economy at this point, is far more likely to augment jobs than it is to automate them. So we shouldn't be worried about the robots taking our jobs still. But the other thing, and I agree with Jason's point about the types of skills, the other thing I think is really critical is that, there's something about people, like human interaction, and people are always going to want to interact with other people. And so focusing on, communication skills, interpersonal skills, leadership, all those sort of things, I think are going to be becoming even more important. So this is my little rant about the Gen AI story. But look, on the national skills taxonomy, I think what we at Jobs and Skills Australia are in the process of building something called the National Skills Taxonomy, and the idea basically is to try to make the process of matching people with jobs and the education training providers that help people get the skills they need for those jobs to help those, those different parties in the system better communicate about what it is they need and how to kind of get it. And so it's interesting that, there is no nationally accepted definition of what the word skill means even.
Yeah.
And so if you say to somebody, what skills have you got, they mean different things. And, there's core competencies, the sort of basic employability skills versus technical skills versus, technology skills. There's a whole range of different ways to think about that. So what we're going to try and do at JSA is build a common language, build a taxonomic framework that gives us a language that hopefully people will be able to describe their own skills in a way that employers recognise, and employers can describe what their jobs require, what things that they need to be able to do and people do need to be able to kind of have in their jobs in a way that education training providers can then teach to. And so hopefully that will provide a kind of basic common language that would allow all those participants to sort of better talk to each other about what's needed in the labour market.
That's fantastic. Go ahead, John. I was just going to talk to you.
Yeah, if I could add to that, and coming back to David's earlier point around the skills mismatch and the detrimental effect of that on productivity. Again, so if I sort of focus on international students in particular, we've got good evidence to show that upon graduation, an international student will not get the same employment outcomes as a domestic student in exactly the same course, right? And the typical, when you interview employers about this, and there've been a few projects done on this, the two typical reasons they give are English language is an issue. Mind you, these students have gotten through, the whole undergraduate degree at, our top universities using English. And then the second issue is around the visa rights and the work rights and the lack of understanding. So if you park both of those aside, which you think, is a relatively simple educational sort of task, and we can bring the employers up to speed and give them comfort with that. I think David's earlier point around the skills mismatch and also, the absence of a taxonomy, I think being able to then go back to employers and say, by the way, if you had any doubts about the skills that these international students have acquired in their time here, including the soft skills, including the critical thinking skills, including the way, the ability to work in an Australian context and an Australian workplace, have a look at this and see the boxes that they've been verified or been able to check off through some sort of additional accreditation process or a skills passport. I think that would be really powerful. I think that would sort of put to bed some of the unspoken fears that employers might have, that might say, this person looks young, they're keen, they're energetic, they've got a slightly different accent, that doesn't bother me, but I can see that they've got the skills, and that's going to, really address, even in that smaller context, that mismatch issue.
So if we are to identify sort of the skills framework, we also have to ensure that the curriculum keeps track with that and actually is delivering against that. So Jason, to you, how do you see educational providers playing a role in building curriculum to match that, but also doing it, and I think this is the real point, with an agility that will match the incoming changes, given that the way in which curriculum is ideated today?
You also just kind of answered the question in that the agility is the key to this being successful. The problem ultimately isn't a technological issue. It is people change. So, and there's a lot of upskilling that will actually need to change or happen or occur within institutions to upskill the SMEs in how do you assess, based on skills. How do you understand skills? I mean, to David's exact point, we actually don't even have a definition of what a skill is nationally. So how do we train our staff to prepare better assessments, to constantly understand what's needed by students and reporting and everything else. There's also an element of compliance that actually slows things down. I mean, it's there as a safety net, but for institutions to constantly need to reaccredit potentially, if there is a change of more than say 50% of a course offering or a degree offering, we actually need to go through a fairly lengthy accreditation process. And if we're now in a world where things change really quick, how do we do that in a way that's both meaningful for the students and to the employees, but also hit our compliance requirements? So there's things there that need to be discussed, obviously, with DOE and others, but I think there are solutions. They're just not technological. So we're going to need a lot of upskilling. We're going to need a lot of, expertise brought in-house that understand assessment, and how do we refactor our degrees and our qualifications, our micro-credentials, whatever level you want to go at, so that they're based on assessing these skills versus delivering content to teach these skills. Because if we're not being rigorous in how we assess, how do we guarantee that our graduates are actually leaving these qualifications with the skills we purport that they have? So that's a really big change for universities. Sure, we do high stakes assessments. Sure, we get them to do things as part of their course and their subjects. But is it truly a rigorous representation of what it is that we're expecting them to graduate with, or what we're saying they graduate with? Today, probably not. To be totally transparent, most degrees are just a hodgepodge of courses, subjects that are put together that may not actually have a meaningful relationship or a sort of progression that needs to be fixed as well. So there's a lot, and I don't think this is a technology issue. I think this is a systemic inertia, people issue that needs to have a lot of training and a lot of understanding, because all of these universities, they're big institutions. We're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of people, right? That's a significant change piece, and I'd be super keen to hear everyone's opinions on what we can do to drive that change forward, because I think universities are going to need to lean on the expertise of some of the folks in the room and some other institutions to help us drive that forward.
Thank you, Jason. Over to each of you. I think that's a fantastic comment.
The other dynamic that's at play here is the type of learner that we're talking about now. So yes, there's people who are coming in through the normal sort of education training system as they sort of just move through it from sort of childhood into maturity. But I think increasingly now we're going to see this need for lifelong learners, and so people having to learn throughout their careers. And so the assessment challenge that goes with that is different again. But I think the nature of the learning content that people have got to be able to access, how you package that in a way that is useful to them, I think is fundamental. Unless we are able to package learning in a form that makes it accessible to a very broad range of people, and by accessible it might mean how it's delivered, but also just the time it takes to do those things, then we're not going to meet, back to David's point, the needs of the economy, which is fundamentally about productivity and how to enable people to participate to their potential. And so I think there is a difference between those two elements. And so therefore what we need is something that is has a lot more flexibility around it, enables people to interact with that learning and training system in different ways, from different locations, doing different things at different times. And I think that's a really important part of one of the things that we have to address as we go forwards. And it's an absolutely driving reason why we should be talking about skills rather than traditional qualifications.
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely.
Yeah, look, and I think I'd pick up on that, and sort of, the argument about tertiary harmonisation is really around kind of helping people move in and out of the system throughout their life, and to build on their skills and to update them and refresh them continually throughout their working life. And really, the vet and higher education systems are so different. I mean, there are some similarities between them, but they really are very different in a lot of ways. And so it's quite difficult for people to navigate those transitions and just understand how the systems work. So we think that there's a lot of work that can be done around, improving the consistency between the two systems. There are funding and regulatory settings that drive people in a particular direction, regardless of what their preferences might be. So that's kind of problematic. We think, a nationally consistent approach to credit recognition is kind of critical.
Mm.
You know, even recognition of prior learning. If we had a nationally consistent approach to that, that would be a big step. Even, you know, nationally consistent approach to prep courses and how we make sure that people have got the right literacy and numeracy to be able to take on a particular formal education. But beyond that, you know, I think the other thing that I think the system needs is more industry engagement, more connections between education and training providers and what industry are kind of calling for in their jobs. And a big part of that, I think, is also a more a clearer approach to work integrated learning. I think, you know, our evidence shows that people who do qualifications that have got work integrated learning, like apprenticeships and other kind of formal structured approaches, you know, you get the practical and the job experience of the technical skills, but you also get those soft skills and, you know, what it's like to work in an office environment or in a workplace. You know, that's embedded in the way you're learning the technical skills as well, and you come out of the training kind of much closer to hitting the ground running.
Yeah, absolutely. John, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot I agree with there, which I won't repeat. I mean, you know, that issue of sort of flexibility and adaptability, industry voices in the process. I guess maybe the one thing I'd sort of highlight is, you know, the onerous and rigorous process of getting a course either nationally accredited in VET or accredited, self-accredited or otherwise in higher ed. I mean, they take a long time. There's no doubt about that, right? And I think there's fair criticism to say, look, by the time something gets accredited, the world has moved on a little bit. But so that I accept that. But I think we've got to ask the question, well, you know, how quickly could you possibly do something while assuring quality as well, and while ensuring that you have that consultation with industry and getting the right experts at the table, because these things take time. And I'll give you a really interesting case study. So Scott Galloway, who's a very famous sort of professor at NYU Stern, you know, serial entrepreneur, he set up this group called Section. And the whole point of that was to give you 80% of an MBA education, equivalent to the NYU Stern School, at 20% of the cost. And he literally had the same professors delivering, you know, moonlighting and delivering this program equivalent to an MBA, but at a much cheaper rate. And to be honest, it didn't take off. And I think that there's a question there around, you know, when people look at something and they're looking for the quality markers, you know, they want to know that it's gone through some sort of rigorous, robust process that's been put together. I'm not sort of saying that it wasn't part of that, but, you know, people still go to NYU and pay, you know, 10 times the price to get that degree. And even though they can online very conveniently, probably in a more engaging format, far more cost effectively do it, you know, with this other outfit. But they're new, they're untested, they're unknown. The employers haven't heard of them. You know, I think there's a real sort of challenge here where we can sort of say, well, let's just do everything fast and quick and be responsive. But you know, these institutions have built up these, you know, at times excessively onerous processes to ensure quality over time. So, you know, and so how do we sort of strike that balance and again, sort of maintain the currency and the trust in these credentials while being quick and adaptable and flexible and responsive?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess my last question for all of you, understanding the double-edged nature of this, before we throw to questions from the audience, is what is a practical step that each institution, whether they're vocational or higher education, could, you know, feasibly take over the next year to start to get ready for what we know is coming, which will be unknown and seismic. We know that much.
I'll go and I'll just, this might sound a bit trite in terms of the topic of this panel, but I think engaging with government and making sure that, you know, everyone is as engaged as possible and on board with this idea of something like a skills passport, or, you know, however that might eventuate, I think is a really critical step, because individually, I think lots of entrepreneurs have tried to set up competition to the universities, competition to the vet system. Some of it succeeded, but if you look around, with all the technology and MOOCs and online and everything being super accessible, we're still getting maybe too many people enrolling in university, to bring it back to the earlier conversation. So how do we sort of be part of that change and make sure that we're recognizing skills in a way that's meaningful for the future? I think government has a huge role to play in ushering that in, because it is going to be the collaborative mechanism. It's developing a public good here that everyone can then rely on and buy into. I'm hugely supportive of that approach.
I'd add, I think it's OECD have defined 80,000 skills. I think that's like going to make your head explode. So I'd like us to focus on maybe 13 core skills, and those are the skills that are fundamental across all jobs, all occupations. And wouldn't it be good if we just started there?
I'd probably say invest in your people. For me, that's probably the number one thing. We're going through rapid change, and if we are, and there are things in flight with the government reporting, making sure that we are actually reporting what our graduates end up with in a quantifiable sort of way. So that is in flight. How do we start the change? So how do we upskill our academics? How do we upskill our professional staff so that they're ready for this transition? I think that'll be really important, and something that I'd probably prioritize above all else, because people change is what ultimately will be the blocker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'll pick up on John's point. Come and talk to us. We would love to engage with the whole sector. And in fact, one of Jobs and Skills Australia's roles is try and bring all the different participants together, try and work through some of these problems. So we'll be doing work on development of the national skills taxonomy, and we're really keen to engage with as many people in the sector as we can on that in the next little while. And probably the other point, and John makes some interesting points about the outcomes from training. We've done good work on the kind of benefits people get from doing a vocational education qualification in terms of their likelihood of getting a job, and how much income they could expect to earn after training. So I think and there's more work that needs to be done in that space to try and kind of prove the value of training. The point about the qualifications, qualifications are a signal in the labour market. I mean, that is what they do. They help employers choose between people. And so kind of helping employers understand what it is that you get when you do that qualification, and what the individual's bringing to the role, that goes back to that kind of industry engagement and the connection between the employers and the training providers and the education providers. So I think two things: talk to government, but talk to industry and build those connections.
Thank you. We're now going to hand over to our audience to ask any questions that you might have of the panelists here today. Please just pop your questions in the Q&A. The first one is from Sue French. I wonder whether a passport concept narrows skills and capabilities to a checklist. How do we establish a creative way for people to describe their skills achieved and outcomes within a nationally understood language? It's a great question, Sue. Thank you.
Well, I'll have a first crack at it. I mean, I guess that's the kind of key challenge that we're just embarking on with the establishment of the national skills taxonomy. How do we define some very complex concepts in a way that sort of most people will understand and be able to apply practically? Patrick's point about the OECD work. I mean, it's really easy to get really detailed really quickly. So we need something that's, I think in my view would be the way to do that would be to kind of make it hierarchical, so kind of higher levels with commonality, but then kind of drill down and have more detailed levels below that, so people can kind of use the level of detail that they need. But I think the only way to really make this work is to make sure everybody's involved in the conversation, so we get as many voices as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other comments? Personally, I think it's actually kind of it's more complicated than even just having the taxonomy of it, because people don't just have a skill, they have a level of that skill. So there will be people who are just burgeoning, and there are people who are experts, and so it's finding a way to Jason, your point, to maintain the rigor that the post-secondary or tertiary sector provides, which I believe is probably why there hasn't been the uptake of the MOOCs and all the other things, because it doesn't come with that rigor. And so being able to find a middle ground to maintaining that rigor and also providing enough insight to employers for them to be confident that, they're hiring Jason and Jason's an expert, or they're hiring Becky and Becky's middle of the ground, and here's how she can proceed to embellish and grow her skills. So
I also think making it easy for people, or at least teaching from early ages, like, and I'm talking school age, like K-12, the language of skills and how they articulate their skills will continue to be really important. Sure, we may have a platform in the future that ticks a box and says, hey, yes, you've obtained X skill, but you still need to be able to articulate that, because that learning journey will be unique to every single person on the planet. So how do they evidence what they've done in a way that's meaningful to employees, but also more importantly to themselves? I think that's something that, it's just something we need to think about, and making sure that we're not removing the human from the learning.
yeah, absolutely.
And isn't the reality that it's not all about skills? I mean, there's still a place for competencies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There are some things that are skills prone, and there are other things which are still absolutely going to need competencies. And so to think that the whole world is going to change, I think that's probably unhelpful, but being clear about where it must change, I think that's a way of trying to prioritize. But I think that if we try and do everything, then I think we'll get nowhere.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of our panelists today for taking this time to enlighten all of us with the future of skills across Australia and also globally. So we will be putting this onto a format where others can download and share it, and posting this available for others on LinkedIn. So thank you everyone who attended today. And we look forward to progressing this conversation as it evolves over the next 18 months.
Have an amazing day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.